you've got to accept that there'll be times that you won't win. There'll be times when you're not going to be so successful. I think as a fan, you've got to always think that that moment when you come out of a trough, you come out of a difficult period, that you'll find another moment that's a high that will be one of the best experiences you've ever had.
Errol, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm very delighted, especially having a fellow Manchester supporter coming from that place in my life. How often do you go back
I'm
there?
glad to hear you're a Manchester United.
I am now, as I'm hosting you. How often do you go back there?
Well, I'm a season ticket holder
Are you?
for United. Now, obviously, with my role, it's quite difficult
Sure.
to, on the one hand, travel the world, and then when I go home and with my wife and two daughters, say at the weekend, oh, by the way, I'm off to Manchester.
Yeah.
So I probably go less than I would like to, but I probably go up and see them maybe 10, 12 times a season.
Oh, amazing. Good. It's got to have that. Good to have that balance.
Yes.
Of what's in the heart as well as in the organisational things.
But I watch and follow them all the time. So on TV, they get all the worst, and my mood swings when I'm good and we're winning, and increasingly at the moment in the last few years, when we're not, it's a bit of a problem.
Well, thank you for letting me miss home a little bit on that one. But let's go into these questions. I've got some great questions for you. And looking for your perspective, the wisdom that you've had within the group, the diversity of thought and the representation of the business is critical for the angle on these. Organisations are operating under increasingly complex internal environments, as we all know. Disruptions that are more frequent, more impactful, and more interconnected. How does this change the characteristics an organisation needs to thrive?
Well, it's a really broad question, and I think I could answer that a number of different ways. I think what I'd start with is in the era that we're in. I think a lot of organizations, if you think about it post-pandemic, and having been through as big an impact as that had on any organization, literally in any part of the world, I think now recovering from that, the impact of that has had on their workforce and the workforce dynamics. Are people in the office or not? Are people back on the production line or not? What does that look like? But then dealing with the ever-increasing tide of technology change and how they need to embrace that, dealing with some of the geopolitical tensions and issues that we have at the moment that mean, part of the implication of that is a high inflation environment. So what we've seen in terms of cost of living and what that means in terms of the ability of organizations to retain their workforce in the same way.
Right.
To then thinking about things like sustainability and people having to embrace, or organizations having to embrace how they become more eco-friendly, and if they're an energy producer, how they switch to new ways of developing their products, or if they're a consumer, how they figure out how they use energy in a much better way going forward. So all of these things kind of collide in terms of what organizations need to do, and then ultimately it's down to people within those organizations to make that change happen. And human beings by nature don't like change. They're quite happy to talk about change as it relates to other people changing. But when it comes to them changing, it's a different story. So I think the biggest thing that organizations have to do with all of these topics, which are very extraneous in nature and complex and diverse, is that ultimately it's the people that make all of these things happen. And, I think we talk a lot about there's the right brain and left brain way of looking at that. If you like, there's the IQ bit that, do I understand why I need to do something? But fundamentally, it comes down to a bunch of emotions with people and whether they want to do something. So that the nature of that change, being able to thrive, depends a lot on leaders, workers, management, executives being aligned on the need to change, wanting to change, and feeling passionate about doing so.
Have you noticed any key characteristic changes with how workforces are segregated or decisions are made or how people are interacting together?
Well, I think this is an ever-changing situation. But as I say, from a post-pandemic perspective now, we've got a generation of what everybody knows as Gen Z coming into the workplace,
Right.
who know no different
Right.
other than an environment of working remotely. So they've either studied remotely or they came into the workforce working remotely. And so they want flexibility in so people say now, you will learn and your career will get better by being in the office and learning from your elders, if you like, and those that are more experienced than you. They say, but we don't want the commute for an hour or 90 minutes a day. We like the flexibility. We like being able to work at 9 p.m. in the evening and not do a traditional 9 to 5 and sit down in a commuter network for periods of time. So that's one end of the spectrum. And then you've got a number of people that checked out of the work environment at a particular age, that were getting to a point in almost at the other end of the age spectrum.
Yeah.
And how do we get those people back? How do we kind of get them to re-engage within the work environment? So this kind of multi-generational workforce, which we've always had, of course, but they've got very different experiences and expectations because in addition to the pandemic aspect, both the Gen Zs and millennials are primarily digital first natives and individuals who will always embrace technology very quickly.
Right.
And they're being managed by people who are not that, who, for the most part, do not embrace technology so easily and will look for other ways and means to do things. So probably levels of frustration that you get on both sides in terms of that equation, but that's certainly a feature of what I see within organizations.
How do you find that for leaders, what kind of guidance can you offer or suggest to help cope with transformation? Because many people at the rock face are busy just trying to get the business to survive, especially with the disrupted markets. And they were saying this morning, 95% of leaders know they have to change how they're looking at things. They need to innovate, to look at this in a new way, or they're going to struggle. What advice would you give leaders to reapproach this transformation agenda?
Well, I think that the first piece of advice to recognize, and we talk a lot about this, is transformation was historically seen as something you did very rarely, and partly because it's quite a big undertaking, but then, in general terms, you'd commit to something, the funding that's required, the dislocation that drives in your business means you do it, and then you kind of close it down, and then it may take a while before you do it again. The reality is now that is business as usual. Yeah. So you've got to constantly be thinking about the degree of change that you're onboarding and taking as an organization, because it's necessary for all the reasons that we've talked about with some of the disruption that's out there and the response that you need to put in place. Yeah. And if therefore it's business as usual, it requires a new muscle in terms of how both you as a leader, but then also your teams operate, to think that there is not the run-of-the-mill BAU type of work that people have historically been able to revert to say, well, this is my traditional job. Right. Transformation by its definition means that you're doing something different. You're doing something that's challenging that BAU mindset. And so you've got to, I think, change the perception of the workers within your organization, and again, the leaders and all of those, to think about how do they think about work differently as a consequence. And I think that requires a number of different skills then that people need to take on board. And one of the things, I don't know if now is a good time to talk about it, so we've done quite a lot of research with Saïd Business School at Oxford University in why do transformations still on a regular basis fail, and what are some of the conditions as to why that happens. And back to the advice then to leaders, we did some research in 2021 that came up with 6 pieces of advice and feedback. but ultimately, to summarize that, it was very much that leaders need to focus actually on the types of characteristics of what happens that make these things fail or not succeed are based around human emotion.
Right.
And the need to tap into and understand the interventions that you as a leader can make to make people feel more empowered, better about making these things happen and the change occurring. And we talk a lot about psychological safety, providing an environment that people feel comfortable to call out when there's a problem, to not always be saying everything's fine, and to allow an organization to be open and honest about and let the workers within their organization say, we might have a problem with this.
Right.
And I've got some ideas on how we might want to fix it, but I want to make sure we acknowledge that we've got a problem and how can we do that. A lot of organizations culturally prefer people to come up with better rose-tinted spectacle views of how things are going, and bury any issues that they have.
Yeah.
And generally what that means is that those issues just become bigger problems and fester. And by the time that they've been ignored for a period of time, they become too big to actually address them, which is why you get to a point of failure.
Do you think because of the increase of working from home is increasing the importance of attention to these factors to ensure that the systems can work for those that may not be under the microscope inside an organization? And how can leaders balance that they can handle this often segregated workforce that the united front doesn't help itself?
Well, I think that we've probably had two dynamics that work a little bit against each other. So I think one aspect of people working remotely and the impact of that has been that many organizations have embraced digital and video technology to communicate and to connect with people. So what that's allowed leaders to do, I think, is actually connect to their workforce more materially and more frequently than they probably would in the physical world, if you like. So they physically have to turn up somewhere to meet with people and have conversations with them. So it gives them an opportunity to see and be with them and sense where they are on their journey more often. But the flip side of that, of course, is, as you will know, in a world of digital technology, and you and I are sitting down across the table from each other, you don't have that thing called body language that you can read and get a sense of, well, how is somebody really feeling and or responding to what I'm saying? And of course, we all read so much more into how somebody is and what their state of mind is based on those things. And of course, you don't get that across a two-dimensional video screen. So I think that causes a challenge to say, am I seeing how that person is really feeling based on what I see on whatever kind of call that I've had and discussion that I've had, either with an individual or with a group of people.
Yeah. I mean, you've been well heard as being somebody that the importance of putting people in the art of transformation.
Yeah.
Very much that it starts with the individuals. This is a disruptive environment, and diversity of thought seems to be now being celebrated more.
Yep.
And perspective. Are you saying that there's more respect and more camaraderie that's happening within the workforces because people, to your point of sitting opposite each other, when that happens, it's more appreciated? Or are you finding people are becoming more distant?
I think it depends on the situation. It depends on the organization, depends on the industry, it depends on the culture of various organizations, because you've got people that work in office environments, you've got people who work in factories, you've got people who work in service industries. So there's a number of different workplace dynamics, I think, that you see in place. But if teaming is an important aspect of what people do, and teaming by that meaning you have to collaborate with others, be it in person or remotely, then having the right conditions for that to be successful are important. And I would always say, and maybe this shows my age, that's much easier to do when you've done that physically, at least in part, maybe at the beginning part of what you do. Then you can move it to a remote relationship. But if your relationship is always remote and virtual, I think it becomes much harder then to collaborate and team in the effective way that you need to. But I think it very much depends. But I think fundamentally, the acknowledgement that leaders need to make of these nuances and these aspects, features, characteristics of, and back to IQ and EQ, that you get a sense of what, not that you're just giving people tasks and activities and they're executing them, but how are they going about doing that? How good are they feeling about it? Do they have an issue with it? Do they agree with it? And all of these things are an important part of that human condition that generally will help to contribute to something happening faster, more effectively, more successfully, versus the opposite.
So how do leaders adapt their behavior and mindsets? What advice could you give them to help them understand how to do this? Because it's okay saying it, but many leaders have been taught on this hero's journey, and this kindred quest is now becoming more important. What guidance could you give them of how to do that? Any sort of, this is a simple approach, and this is the way that we look at it.
Well, I think I mentioned earlier about some of the research that we've done.
Yeah.
Just coincidentally, actually, this week we've published the second phase of that research, which very much goes into giving leaders some very specific advice about different points that they can intervene that will make a difference. We call them turning points, effectively. So if in any scenario of what you're driving as an organization, you can very easily plot based on some of the human dynamics of what's happening and how people are bought into a change or transformation, whatever it may be, as to whether it's likely to go south or whether it's likely to soar and people are going to support and achieve the outcome. And so, part of the guidance to those leaders is getting better sensory skills about spotting where those moments are happening, when those turning points are happen. So I think getting a better way of sensing that is really important. Now, you would say then, well, how does somebody do that if they don't natively have those skills? And I think this is where, again, you can actually, for those that maybe are not high on EQ, you can still intellectualize this and actually say, well, this is a process and this is the way to help enable to make that happen. So surround yourself with people who can sense it, and then go into the rational mode of, therefore, what intervention do you need to make in order to make a difference? And so I think it's back to, you talked earlier about having diversity of thought and people.
Yeah.
If you're the type of leader who isn't that way inclined and doesn't have large elements of empathy or ability to reach out and understand how people may be feeling, then you need to have people within your team that can do that for you.
Right.
We talk a lot about influencers in its broadest sense. You know that with the kind of generations that we have going up through social media now, but within organizational construct as well. There are also influencers who, not from a hierarchy or organizational structure perspective, but who influence the rhythms of the organization and the way people feel about things. So understanding who that some of those individuals are, getting them on side, getting the feedback from them directly as to what could we do differently that's going to make people feel better about this change and more bought in and aligned to making this happen. I think that becomes really important in terms of driving the right interventions that are going to make this thing successful. So it's having those sensory skills to spot that there might be a problem in advance and therefore intervening, because what most organizations have is a bunch of KPIs, dashboards, metrics that look at effectively recording problems when they're a problem. What I've just described is that sensing aspect is you would know about that before it's become a problem with those KPIs. So then you can intervene to stop it becoming a problem. That's I think what leaders need to embrace to get to the pathway of success.
We started touching on football.
Yep.
And being an avid fan and focusing on observing human nature with football, what have you learned from the pitch that influences your philosophy on team and how great teams within organizations that have players from all over the world or maybe separated at different times, what have you learned from that that's helped influence your understandings?
It's a great question, but I very much applicable to the team I support. But I think, and because they've obviously had periods of great success as well as now not such great success. And what I would say is, team is by definition about a group of individuals,
right?
And they need to have an objective that unites them, and so that's very important in terms of what a football team does, and it's very important in terms of organisationally what happens within companies, governments, etc. However, so it's a team of individuals with an objective, but the individuals within that team also are people who have their own point of view, who have their own ways of working, that you have to recognise that as much as they'll align to the team objective, part of the ways and means of getting them to do that is acknowledging them as a human being in their own right and making sure that you tailor, if you're the captain of the team or the manager of the team, you tailor your approach to them that gets them on side, that makes them feel motivated and committed to the overall team goal. So I think it's those two dimensions, and ultimately it's having the discipline to see that the team ethos and the team ethic matters a huge amount, and that everybody is committed to doing it for each other and the success that comes from that. Because fundamentally, there's no I in team. There is no success for an individual in a team sport. You've got to see the benefit of the team benefits ultimately the individual, and then making sure that's clear to all of those folks. But adjusting the way that you operate, as I say, so that each individual feels that they're heard, that they're connecting with that captain, that manager, that coach, whoever it may be.
It's interesting. I love the parallel. Like many businesses have been very successful. Many businesses that go through these times of troughs, like Man United. We're here for EY Innovation Realize, right? Yeah. For this rethink agenda. What guidance would you give Man United to rethink? and also the fans. Like especially in organisations, it's also how the consumers rethink.
Well, look, I think you've lived in Manchester, and I know you're an avid Manchester United fan, or at least recently converted one.
Yes.
But I think in any sporting scenario, as a fan, you've got to accept that there'll be times that you won't win. There'll be times when you're not going to be so successful, and I think you've got to accept that you're a fan for life. That's that in many ways.
The long game.
Yeah, that in many ways makes it therefore different to a company type scenario that you as an employee, if it doesn't work for you for a period of time, they'll check out and move somewhere else. As a football fan, you don't have that. So I think you need to acknowledge that in many ways the highs that you get when you do win are actually a function of the fact that they don't happen all the time. And if they did happen all the time, and you see that now, arguably, you're from Manchester, so you no doubt see that the blue side of the city, who are winning a lot at the moment, obviously have done that over the last 10, 12 years. Yeah. The excitement you get from each incremental individual win that gets above the ones that you've previously had is not what it was. So if you take the joy and there's no more pain than the blue side of Manchester has suffered historically of going down. I don't know, they maybe ended in like the 12th tier, didn't they, of English football in the end. But when they won their first title, if you think about the joy that they had at that point versus where they get to now, even their Champions League success that they recently had, I don't think that would equate to that kind of joy. So I think as a fan, you've got to always think that moment when you come out of a trough, you come out of a difficult period, that you'll find another moment that's a high that will be one of the best experiences you've ever had.
And it's a great lesson for leadership, aligning expectancy, aligning what is achievement, and also the importance of the long game versus the short-term disruptions. Talking of which, we've been talking very much about the human element, which is very close to your heart, but the transformation that's going through with emerging technology, where AI is bringing so much disruption, positive and negative. What do you think are the common pitfalls for tech adoption, and how can leaders overcome those?
Well, I think one of the challenges, and you've positioned the disruption and AI. I mean, this is obviously the biggest thing that's out there right now. I think with being, I'm nearly 35 years in the working environment of organizations adopting and adapting new technology over that period of time. And in general terms, it's the hype cycle around technology and the pace at which it's adopted and taken into, especially corporate organizations, is never quite as fast as people would have you believe. So it's always one of those things that it's overestimated in its impact at the outset, but its longer term impact is probably underestimated in terms of what that would look like. So I think what you're going to see is, for instance, in 10 years' time, there'll be so much change as it relates to where AI is taking us, be it generative AI or AI more broadly. But in the next probably 6-12 months, there'll be, or maybe 18 months, there'll be, AI, it didn't really mean anything. It came, it was a big fad in 2023, and now it's fallen off a cliff. It's no longer important. We saw that. I mean, we saw that with the internet and the move to that. We saw it with e-commerce as everybody said, well, that's not taken off. Nobody's going to buy anything in that way, shape, or form. We've seen it with cloud. We've seen it with other technology disruptions that have come along, and I think we'll see it with AI as well. So I think with that in mind, if you're a business leader, it's always about being pragmatic based on which industry, what you do, how you could see the benefits of technology like that, to say, do you want to be a leader in that? Do you want to drive that change because you can see the real benefits as to what that will bring to your business over and above others? Or do you actually want to be a fast follower? Do you want to see others make mistakes, others be the pathfinders, if you like, on finding the best way to use that technology? And then there's nothing wrong with copying success.
Absolutely. Well, it seems like there's never been a more important time, as leaders are now in the they can't get away with the backseat driving. They have to be in the front. It seems to be no better a time to have partners like EY alongside, so you have that diversity of thought and perspectives of what's happening on the long game.
Yeah.
And so thank you for sharing your insights today, Errol.
You're very
really, really delightful. And good luck in the next game. I hope Man United manage to turn the corner.
Thank you very much.
Now that I'm a fan. Excellent.